But for right now, I'll start with Module 2A, which is looking at the specific security requirements that tie to the application boxes for radioactive material, not nuclear material, and specifically for those requirements that come from NRC. What we're going to try to do here is provide a listing of the specific security requirements like we did on the last module yesterday for the DOT requirements, and I'm only addressing the United States domestic shipments. The relevant NRC requirements are found in 10 CFR 37 and some in 10 CFR 73. And as I've mentioned already, Mike Valenzano will be elaborating on Module 2B on the requirements for nuclear material. So we're up to this point in filling tools into our toolbox. The requirements for radioactive materials that come from NRC. Later we'll be talking about, Michael Wengler will talk about the requirements that apply for DOE shipments. And then later also I'll be talking about international shipments. As I've mentioned, Module 1G talked about the requirements that come out of the DOT regulations. Excuse me, Module 1E established the categorization basis, the decision chart that you saw there. And we'll be focusing on the application boxes from chart number 2 at this point. Again, for decision chart number 1, which addresses the international organization categorization and requirements, we'll be talking about that in Module 2C later today. So today, in this module right now, I'm focusing specifically on those application boxes that are circled, that is 2B, 2H, 2K, 2L, and 2M in decision chart number 2. Now the information that's in these application boxes, again, as I talked about in the last module yesterday, it's a very brief summary of what the regulations require. And as with that module, we have an appendix at the end here that has a broader summary, but it still does not totally capture the regulations per se. So, first of all, let's take a look at the requirements that apply to 2B and 2H, and that is the security requirements for radioactive source and byproduct materials. The NRC imposes these requirements through 10 CFR 37 and 73. Byproduct material in certain quantities is defined in 10 CFR 37. It's clarified in an NRC fact sheet, and that fact sheet is included in the CD that you'll be receiving. Byproduct material can include materials other than nuclear materials, such as radium, fluorine 18, cobalt 57, iodine. This is part of what comes out of the fact sheet. It can also include naturally occurring radioactive sources that is processed to increase its concentration for applications such as radium-226. The specific security requirements for the protection of classified information that relates to the radioactive material you find in 10 CFR 73, and those will be summarized in slides 10 and 11. For source material, it is dealt with in 10 CFR 37. It's clarified in an NRC fact sheet. Again, it'll be on the CD. And this is words from that fact sheet. Although generally viewed as nuclear material, it may contain sufficient plutonium to also classify it as Category 1 or 2 quantity of radioactive material. And that's why we have that one question in Decision Chart 2 that asks, could it be, in Decision Charts 4 and 5, we have that where if it's a nuclear material, but it also has Category 1 or 2 quantities of radioactive material, such as plutonium-239, you have to devolve back to Chart 2 to get the rest of the requirements. In that event, as it says here, the shipper will then need to also consider these other requirements, and specific security requirements, again, for the classified information come out of 10 CFR 73. So when you're dealing with these materials, you have to jump between the two sets of regulations. The additional requirements for protection of all information for the source and byproduct material for all modes of transport. Specifically, it is 10 CFR 73, 21, 22, and 23, and that is the application box 2B and 2H. I've made a note here that neither 10 CFR 37 or 73 specifies security requirements for byproduct and source material during transport. However, 10 CFR 73.23 infers requirements by specifying what information is to be protected for shipments. So there's no direct specification of requirements, but by looking at what they say, what information you have to protect, you can infer that all of these could be requirements. I think it's a weakness right now in 10 CFR 37. So from a security standpoint, I would recommend, if I were making a shipment with these materials, I would recommend looking at that specific text and making sure that I have in my transport security plan the types of things that are shown here, such as locks on the freight container or the closed truck, mechanical key designs or passwords, have proper control over those. Transport security measures and physical security plans and procedures, what are they? Put them in the transport plan. It even talks about immobilization devices. What do we mean by that? That could be something where you have a panic button inside the cab of a truck. If you're in trouble, you push the panic button, and that will immobilize the truck by shutting down the engine or whatever. So all these things are mentioned in there as topics that should be in your documents, and as I say, it infers to me that those should be considered when you're establishing the security requirements for byproduct material and source material. Now, the NRC requirements for control of security-related information is in 10 CFR 73, and anyone involved in transport of these materials should consider guidance provided by NRC on what must be done to properly protect this material. And that guidance is provided in NRC Regulatory Issue Summary, RIS is the way they identify that, 2005-31. And there's the title of it, Control Security Related to Sensitive, Unclassified, and Non-Safeguard Information handled by individuals, firms, and entities, et cetera, for the use of source, byproduct, and special nuclear material. So you ought to look at that as well. That also is included in the CD. Moving on to things that are a little more straightforward, we look at Category 1 and Category 2 quantities of radioactive material. That comes from the application box 2K. You recall that we've talked about this earlier. The IAEA Code of Conduct has 25 radionuclides that are listed, and they establish various levels based on the factor D. Category 2, that's 10D. Category 1 is 1000D. In the IAEA regulations, Appendix A to Part 37, they deal with both of these, but they only address those 15 that are at the top of the Code of Conduct. As we've already noted, 10 CFR 37 was recently reissued. The current version is provided in the CD for you. And I'd call your attention here to make sure that you remember that quantities of concern means the quantities of the radionuclides meeting or exceeding the threshold limits as set forth in Table 1 of Appendix I of 10 CFR 37. Quite a bit of nomenclature you have to keep track of in your mind. Here's a note for the discussion which follows on NRC security for these. The summary of security requirements for materials in the regulations in 10 CFR 37, they talk about licensee who transports, licensee who delivers to a carrier for transport, a shipping licensee, and a shipper. And what I've put here, I've rolled all that into just the descriptor of consignor. A licensee who transports possibly could be the carrier, but in my mind, all of these end up being the consignor, the entity that originates the shipment. In addition, 10 CFR 37 talks about receiving licensee or receiver. They use those two terms interchangeably, and in what I've talked about, I've called them consignee, just to try to, in my mind at least, keep from getting confused with the multiple terminology that's used there. So for category 1 and 2 sources, or quantities I should say, 10 CFR 37 imposes mode-specific security requirements for both category 1 and category 2 when transported by road or rail. And these requirements are different for the two different categories. 10 CFR 37 does not impose specific security requirements when it's transported by air or sea. I think you have to devolve over to the IMDG code and the ICAO technical instructions for those. So that's why in the decision chart we have this decision process here. Is the radioactive material high consequence radioactive material, greater than 10D, greater than 3000 A2? This is falling back to the IMO, IMDG code, and the ICAO technical instructions for air and sea transport. If your material exceeds 10D or 3000 A2, you've got a yes. Then you ask yourself, is it being transported by air? If it is, you apply the ICAO technical, the requirements, and those are in 2I. If it's not, and you answer the question, it's going to be transported by sea, you'll fall over to here and apply the requirements that are summarized in 2J. If it satisfies this requirement, but it's going to be transported by road or rail, you fall back out of this and back into the NRC set of requirements. And that's why that chain of questions is included in the decision chart. So here's a summary of the security requirements that come out of 10 CFR 37 for quantities 1 and 2 types of radioactive material, and this is for all modes. Limit access to sensitive information. Establish, implement, and maintain a security program, and review and correct the security program. For a transport security plan, list any additional requirements that you may have in your TSP. For your security procedures, it says that you should develop, maintain, and use implementing procedures. So the carrier or the consignor should establish procedures on how they're going to apply the specific security measures. You're required to provide training commensurate with the responsibilities. Follow a graded approach depending on the person's responsibility in the transport chain. Maintain maintenance and testing. You should implement a maintenance and testing program. Later on, we'll give you an example of how this might be done by preparing a readiness review based on your transport security plan. We'll take you through an example of that. We'll have you actually perform a readiness review and identify deficiencies using a corrective action checklist. That's one way of testing your program. For security and safety equipment, it says that you should lock and physically secure the transport package in the transporting vehicle. Incidentally, that's just out of 10 CFR 39, and that only applies to well logging sources.
Why is that? Why not?
You'll have to.
Those are the ones that slide out the back of the truck.
But from that's more of a safety issue. But in my mind, you should have your packages from a security standpoint locked in a vehicle.
Well, it's a requirement for blocking and bracing in DOT anyway.
Yeah.
But it would apply to that as well. I just wonder why they pick out well logging sources.
I can't tell you that. I've been through all the regulations, and wherever it talks about locks, it talks about locking the vehicle, not locking the package. No. Internationally, recommendation is if you can, you have a robust tie-down system and you have capability of locking that tie-down system. But domestically, we don't have that requirement. The final one here is acting upon reporting and investigating any incidents. And that's true for accidents as well as any terrorist instituted incidents. You coordinate with your local law enforcement agencies for responding to the threats and provide necessary armed response if appropriate. And that comes from 3743 as well. There's additional requirements also for the Category 1 and 2 sources as summarized in 2L and 2M. For Category 1, see the previous one was for both Category 1 and 2. Now we get to Category 1, and that is the higher activity of the two. For shipping documents, you develop and apply a written normal and contingency set of procedures. You need to address what will I do if certain events happen. And that's what we mean by having contingency procedures. Transport pre-planning and coordination. Incidentally, that was for road. Pre-plan and coordinate shipment arrival and departure times with the consignee. That's typical of across the board for most of your materials, and that's all modes. Pre-plan and coordinate with designated state officials. So, if you're transporting by road or rail, you need to talk to the state officials and see what they want. If you're transporting these material through Illinois, I suspect that they might want to meet you at the border with the State Highway Patrol and escort it through the state. They do that with spent fuel. But you'd have to talk to the state officials to determine that. Verify that the consignee is authorized to receive the material. In some cases, the regulations don't specify this, but you should, in all cases, in my mind, make sure that the consignee, or as in NRC would say, the licensee receiver, is authorized to receive that material. If they're not authorized, you shouldn't be shipping it to them. Escort and response force personnel. Individual accompanies the road vehicle driver for extended travel. What it's saying here, and then that's a very brief summary, it talks about the DOT requirements for the hours of operation that a truck driver has. And if it exceeds, if the length of the trip exceeds his allowed hours, you have to have a co-driver, and you have to make sure that they stay within the DOT requirements for driving time. So an individual accompanies him, and he should be qualified so he can serve as a co-driver. Here we have the two for road: establish and operate a movement control center. That's the words that are used in the regulations for road transport, and a rail communication center for rail transport. And when you read the regulations, there's some subtle differences between what a movement control center is and what a rail communication center is. I think what they were after there, after reading it about twice, is that for large rail operators, they generally have some type of rail communication center monitoring their shipments. And you can tie onto that and use that system, whereas generally the movement control center, they want that to be more or less a standalone type operation that you establish as a consignor. Provide redundant communications. How do we do that? Share a couple of personal experiences. Many years ago, I mentioned earlier, I was responsible for operating a Transcom, which is a system now used by DOE. It's operated out of Albuquerque for monitoring the shipments of whip shipments, for example. And we had a shipment of return research reactor fuel coming in from Europe to Charleston, and it was to be carried by rail to Savannah River. The DOE manager we were doing this for decided he wanted to ride with the rail system. He got on it was a special caboose with armed guards and such. He got on there, pulled out his cell phone. 10 miles outside of Charleston, he didn't have any signal. So he didn't realize that there are holes in the system. And back then especially, basically cell phones follow the interstates or just for large population density areas. He had to rely on Transcom as his sole source of communication. That was using a satellite-based communication system. So you need to be aware that you can lose your signal with cell phones, and in fact, you can lose it with satellite as well. I have a satellite radio in my car, and there's an area I go through a canyon that has a lot of trees. Summertime, I lose it because all the leaves hang over the road. There's about 10 miles. I don't have any signal from the satellite. But you can have other systems that use multiple satellites, and hopefully that improves your communication capability. So when they say that you have to have, where did I lose it here? Redundant communications, there's also words in other parts of the regulation that say redundant and continuous communication. So for a shipment by road, maybe cell phones is one way of doing it. Satellite-based communication is the second. But you have to think about that when you see the word redundant. Provide continuous and active monitoring. That's more than just the communication. That is tracking the shipment. Transcom does that tracking. The RFID system that we'll see demonstrated later this week also can do that. Provide advance notification of NRC and designated state officials. So in this case, for Category 1 quantities of radioactive material, you have to actually notify NRC before you ship. And there's 2 different offices that are involved in that. I haven't put those in here, but you'll see those in the regulations in 3777. You want to ensure that the movement control centers are prepared to promptly implement pre-planned procedures for responding to route deviations or notification of incidents, and they contact the LEAs as needed. What would be a route deviation that they're talking about? If you read it, that's something that may be caused by construction on the highway, or it may be caused by weather situation where they initially planned to go on one route, but snow has blocked that and they want to keep going, so they choose a second route. But it's all part of command and control, and that should be built into your movement control center. Finally, on this one, follow specific reporting procedures for lost or missing shipments. In all cases, you lose a shipment, you've got to report that. Tom?
I'd make one comment on verifying the consignee is authorized to receive material. True, if I'm standing there looking at their license, but also making sure that they can receive it based on the current inventory on hand. We've had lots of cases where we've prepared all of a sudden the quantity we want to exceed based on their inventory would exceed their overall license, and they've had to shuffle material to make that happen. So a lot of times if you're looking at just their blank license, what their limits are doesn't always reflect what they've got on inventory. So we've had that experience.
Yeah.
That used to be a big deal with waste brokers.
And we've been, in a particular example, like we've made naturally uranium shipments, and the license is through the state, and not, with the state of Tennessee, and making sure that they usually are pretty generous license, but we sent a lot of material, natural uranium, and that would have put them over their license limit until they could offload some other material. So just have a copy of their license, don't think automatically, yeah, you could shoot it on down there.
Yeah, it's a good point. For Category 2, little less demanding set of requirements. Verify the consignee is authorized to receive, same. Coordinate shipment arrival time with the consignee. Confirm the shipment receipt by consignee. It's interesting that this is in Category 2, but not in Category 1. What that's saying is, I plan to deliver a product to you at between noon and 4 o'clock on Thursday. And if it doesn't show up, the consignee is supposed to come back to the consignor and through the carrier or both and say, I haven't received it. And with time, if it hasn't been received and you can't find out where it is, that becomes a out of control or lost shipment. And then you have to report that to NRC and respond accordingly. Consignee confirm the shipment receipt. That may be consignor, confirm the shipment receipt by the consignee. You're right. Consignor notify the consignee of the new no later than arrival time. So if the material's in transit and something happens, such as a route deviation, he has to go out to the consignee and say, instead of delivering it Thursday afternoon, it's not going to be there till Saturday night. Are you going to be able to receive it? Whatever happens there. Communications and tracking systems maintain constant control or surveillance during transit and have the capability for immediate communication. As you can see, that's less onerous than for Category 1, which requires that control center.
Hey, Ron, the one back with the consignor notifying the consignee, since it's on a carrier, would you have to then include instructions to the carrier as the consignor that any delay has to be reported back to them immediately with new ETAs for package arrival?
I think if you read the regulations in detail, that's exactly what is expected. That the carrier and consignor are in communication through this constant control and surveillance process. And if there's deviations, the consignor will know about it, and then he communicates to the consignee. Or he may, through contractual arrangements, put that responsibility on the carrier, and the carrier would report it. But all three need to be in communication.
We had that happen when we had a truck breakdown. And as soon as it broke down, they contacted us. We contacted their dispatch. And so we ended up having to contact the consignee that we had to delay the shipment. We also had to contact the states, because even though it's Category 2, we had to notify the states that shipment had been delayed, and it would be passed through their states to a certain time.
But at least if it happens in Missouri, we have to find a safer place for that thing to sit.
Yeah.
Typically on the shipping bills that we see, it says that on there. That any delay or any breakdown or anything like that, there has to be communication back to the consignor.
Ron, I don't know, did we include new reg 2155 in the CD? This implementation guidance for 10 CFR 37?
It's in the CD, yes.
Is that on the CD? Yeah. Read through that new reg, there's lots of elaboration on these specific topics. But bottom line, the regulatory requirements and the guidance implies that you can ship Category 2 quantities using FedEx or UPS. And in terms of the constant control and surveillance, just that tracking number that we get is sufficient. And so the arrival time is agreed to with the receiver, with the consignor, and then there's a no later than arrival time. I think it's 4 hours. It's a 4-hour window, if I remember correctly. And so there's wiggle room there. And that's why you have to have communication between the carrier, the shipper, and the receiver, and the consignor and the consignee. And obviously the big difference with Category 1, you're tracking that shipment basically in real time. You're getting real-time tracking, you're getting periodic updates from the carrier. So you know when it gets to
Yeah, for the less dangerous shipments, something like FedEx is a good example of where the tracking they do. I don't know how many of you have purchased something through whatever and you monitor it on the internet. I've purchased things and it's told me that it's 6 miles away from my house. It'll be things like that. I had the privilege years ago of going to the FedEx distribution center in Memphis, Tennessee, and spent the night there. And that was amazing to watch them. But they have a separate line for dangerous goods from the rest of the material. It comes off an aircraft. It comes out of the cargo container. The barcode is scanned, and it goes down this separate line. And wherever its destination is, it goes off to that point. You know what's going right through the whole complex. And you know when it got on the plane, you know when the plane took off. Yeah, FedEx does a good job UPS does also. A number of companies do. Again, follow specific reporting procedures for lost or missing shipments. And comparison of Security International and domestic measures for Module 1E. Just looking at the application boxes, these two slides compare the example that we addressed in 1E, and for application box 1C, we were looking at prudent management practice, UN high consequence radioactive material requirements, and it's recommended you consider the IA basic safety and enhanced security level measures. And that compares with that whole suite of requirements we've just talked through here. What's interesting is to compare these in this table for that specific shipment, 300 T becquerels of thallium 204. You'll see that the international requirements in SS9, this represents basic security level, enhanced security level, and this is what is recommended in the RID. In other words, that is the road requirements for Europe. So there's a pretty good comparison between these up to this point. Not such a good comparison here. Shaded areas, there's nothing. So you can see that U.S. domestic transport has quite a few more requirements than does the international. But there isn't a direct overlap. For example, the in-transit storage measures, that's required internationally, but it's not required domestically. So this gives you a comparison between those for that type of shipment. And then this is just the fact that the basic security level measures recommends these actions, whereas neither the RID nor the U.S. domestic recommends this, such as carry packages and secure enclosed vehicles where possible. Gets back to the lock issue for just the one thing. Written instructions for conveyance, control, exchange, and protection of security-related information. It's not addressed over here. Identification of carriers and consigners. And then we have the appendix, which is a broader summary of what's in the regulations. So if there's no questions, we'll transition to Mike on Module 2.